with the legend herself, Professor Romila Thapar. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking your time from your schedule for doing this session.
Thank you. Thank you very much
How
for
are you,
asking me.
ma'am? I hope everything is fine in Delhi with you.
So far, yes, we've just had news of a massive fire in Rajpat Nagar, the central market.
Oh, that's really sad.
Apparently, a really horrendous fire. I don't know what caused it, but
That's really,
otherwise, yes, we're carrying on.
yeah, I didn't know about the fire, but that's really sad. But I think today what we are going to talk about is a life in history. You have had a long career in history for more than 60 years now. You completed 60 years in the profession last year when we celebrated with the Karwaan Distinguished Lecture, if you remember.
Yeah,
And that was truly an honor hosting you for the first time. And we are really honored to have your support for Karwaan for the last 1 year. And you continue to support us. That's very, a delightful thing for us and honorable thing for
very,
us.
very nice for me to be part of this movement. I think it's absolutely terrific what you're doing. Very
Thank
necessary.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And to begin the conversation, I must ask you, how did this journey, this life and history started for you? Was it intentional or just a random decision that you took?
Uh, um, I'm just looking for a few notes that I made on the subject. Um, it started accidentally, actually. Accidentally in the sense that I had absolutely no intention of becoming either a historian or an academic. When I was doing my BA, I didn't know what I was going to do with myself, except that there were certain subjects I was interested in. I had been very interested in biology, which I did at school, but then that interest shifted, and my interest in literature became more forthright. And then ultimately, I ended up doing history. So it was accidental. But I should say, there were two factors that intervened in this movement of this direction. Two things. When I was in school, and I was in school in the 1940s, teenager, it was a high point in Indian nationalism. And all of us in our teens were young, budding nationalists. We were constantly going off to protest meetings and shouting slogans and rushing around. Sometimes I think there's a little bit of that still going on inside me. But anyway, the elders would say, look, take it easy, you're not going to bring about independence, leave it to the others. But no, we had to do all our shouting, and we were not to be kept silent. That is, of course, something which has been a very strong part of my life, that I will not be kept silent. I will speak up whenever I feel like it, whatever the consequences. And at that time, with nationalism getting hotter and hotter and independence coming closer and closer, one of the big debates was, what is the identity of being Indian? It was very closely linked to how we saw history. Because remember that, nationalism takes a lot from history. It in fact builds, constructs its ideology and its self-representation very much from what it takes from history or what it imagines history might be. So there was this big debate on the identity of the Indian and how history plays a role in that, forming that identity. And one began to ask questions like, in a vague kind of way, not too seriously, but nevertheless, what role does the past have in creating the identity of the present? And this was a question that was frequently asked and very often debated. So that was one thing. The ambience of that time was very conducive to people looking creatively at the past. The second impetus in my life was much more personal, in the sense that it was around that time when I left school and I was waiting to join college. And in those days, of course, school leaving was in December. You took the exam in December and the university opened in June or July. So you had a 6-month gap. And I was greatly looking forward to having a 6-month vacation. I mean, this was going to be a godsend. I would do all kinds of things that I had wanted to do and never been able to do, and so on. And read the kinds of books that I couldn't read because I was reading textbooks. What my mother used to call storybooks, but this was actually good literature. But she was very contemptuous of reading novels, for example, and one had to explain that this was not just a Mills and Boon type of novel, but this was something serious. But in the course of this, my father developed an interest in classical art, Indian classical art. And he started reading heavy tomes, you know, Gopinath Rao and J.N. Banerjee and all these people, in order to understand it. And then one fine day he said to me, I can't be reading all this on by myself. Why don't you also read these books? And then in the evening when I come back from office, we can have a little discussion on what you read. So who was I to say, no, I don't want to read these books? And I started reading them. And the end result, of course, was that we started talking about these things, and I got vaguely interested in the Indian past and the early Indian past at that. Now, you had mentioned earlier that you were interested in what did I learn and what did I unlearn from this experience. I mean, the rest of it is fairly straightforward in the sense that finally I did my honors from Shimla because my father was transferred from Pune, where I was in school and college. And I did it in literature. So when I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, they said, you can't do any research in history because your honors degree is in literature. So I had to repeat my degree, and I did history honors at London, and then I went on. And by the time I finished that and started thinking of the possibility of doing a PhD, I was hooked to being a historian and to being an academic. There was no looking back. But it took quite a few years before I got there. But in this process, for example, what did I learn and what did I unlearn, which is what you asked me. First of all, both these processes of learning and unlearning take a long time. You can't learn in a hurry. You can't take an exam in 2 years and say, I know the subject, because you don't. You've only touched the edge of the subject. It takes many years. And similarly, when you start dropping your interest in a particular subject and feeling this is not very helpful, it takes a long time to be able to finally say, no, I'm not interested in this subject, I'm more interested in that. So it is a time process, and one has to be, remember that the whole process of education, after all, is there to fill you up with ideas. So if you're going to remove those ideas or change them or something, it's a complicated thing. And the teaching of history and the writing of history, and I'm talking about the 1950s, which is, well, 70 years ago, 75, 80, getting on to 80 years ago. History was very heavily imprinted with nationalist and colonial ideas. The colonial interpretation was the first interpretation of history, and then came nationalism, and nationalism had a whole range of interpretations. So let me try and explain this a little bit. The colonial interpretation of Indian history at that time in the 19th century, which is the crucial century for this, consisted of two main theories. One theory was the argument that the foundations of Indian culture, by which the colonials actually meant Hindu culture, culture and civilization was established by the Aryans. And the Aryans become a very important component of Indian history. And the argument went that everything of any importance came from that contribution. This meant a huge emphasis on the study of the Vedic period as primary in virtually every aspect of history. Now, this is the imprint largely of two things. One was the scholarship of people like Max Muller and various other scholars of Sanskrit in Europe who studied these texts. And the other was at the popular level. They founded the non-Indians, Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky, founded a society called the Theosophical Society, which also played a role in underlining how important the Aryan contribution was to Indian culture and civilization. Now, these were essentially 19th century ideas based on a study of India as well as influenced by the study of what was going on at that time in Europe. I mean, in the 19th century, for example, the study of race became a very important study. Everybody was going around trying to find identities, racial identities with different groups of people, and, you know, propagating culture in racial terms and so on. So the notion of an Aryan race and Aryan culture was, in fact, a very important notion at that time. Now what has happened, this was the 19th century. Now, by the middle of the 20th century, about a century later, there was a slow process of unlearning.
This meeting is being recorded.
How did that come in? Anyway, yeah. So there were new ideas coming in to this in the study of this period. Is it okay? Shall I carry on? Yeah. And the new ideas were, first of all, that, you know, there was a lot of archaeological evidence coming up of northern India, Punjab, the northwest, so on. Of course, the Harappa culture had already been excavated in the 1920s and 30s and so on. So there was this archaeological evidence which was suggesting that there were lots of people, there were lots of little cultures that were there, settlements and so on. And so the basic question was that if there is this multiplicity of cultures, how did they relate to each other? You can't have cultures in total isolation. I mean, if there are many of them, then they must be relating to each other. So that posed a problem. The second was a little later on in the 20th century, when there was a lot of discussion of linguistic evidence, when the study of linguistics became important. It confirmed the presence of non-Aryan people, because now it's being said by specialists in linguistics that the Sanskrit of these texts does have elements from other languages as well, especially the Dravidian languages. So if that is so, then there must have been Dravidian speakers there, which means that there were two lots of languages that were carrying on. I mean, one was a dominant language, but the other language was certainly known. And the third bit of evidence, which is leading to a fair amount of questioning, is very recent in the last couple of decades, and that is the genetic evidence that they have found from various DNA studies, that it was around that time, after the Harappa culture, during the period of the decline of the Harappa culture and thereabouts, that new people seem to have come in to northern India. And the links so far are suggestive of their coming from beyond the northern mountains, that is from the Central Asian region. Now, these three new disciplines, as it were, archaeology, linguistics, and genetics, is forcing us to ask a different set of questions, which is, that you had not only the Aryan-speaking people, but you had other people as well, it would seem. So what was the relationship? And how did this culture evolve? Because we are now beginning to feel that where there are diverse cultures, there is bound to be an interface and interaction of cultures. Therefore, the historian is not studying only the dominant culture. The historian also has to study the other cultures and study the interaction between all these different cultures. So that is one kind of theory that we are unlearning, the 19th century theory, which we are beginning to question somewhat now. And some very interesting historical research is coming up on that. The second dominant colonial theory, which is still playing a very important role politically as well, was a theory that was put forward by James Mill in his History of British India in 1817 onwards. And his argument was that India has always consisted of two nations, the Hindu and the Muslim. And the relationship was always hostile. And when the Muslims were in power, they oppressed the Hindus. This is Mill's theory. And it's a theory that is taken up by various other writers at that time, like Eliot and Dowson and so on. Now, this is a theory which then went on to produce in history the basic periodization of Hindu, Muslim, and British. It was on the basis of James Mill's theory of the two nations that they talked about, a Hindu period, a Muslim period, and British period. This is finally, thank goodness, been discarded. And we now talk about the ancient period, the early medieval, the medieval, and the modern, which makes history, it gives it a little distance from the dominance only of religious categories. We now do look at other categories as well, which is extremely important. And it also takes away from the very sharp distinction that was made between, for example, the Hindu and the Muslim period. When you came to 1200 AD, historians would say, oh, this is when the Muslim period begins. So we stop looking at Sanskrit texts and we only look at Persian texts. And a lot of the history of the Muslim period, as it was then called, was written on the basis only of the Persian text. What is happening now is that people are saying, wait a moment, they may have been ruled by dynasties that were Muslim in religion, but Sanskrit literature continued to be written. Sanskrit texts continued to be written, I mean, in Kashmir and various other places. And so now there is a look at Sanskrit texts and what are they saying about Muslim rule. And so you're getting a slightly, substantially different picture emerging from these texts, because one is finding that far from the Hindus being altogether oppressed, I mean, some were, but then, you know, people were oppressed even under Hindu rule earlier. I mean, the Dalits had a pretty rough time. If one's talking about victimization and oppression, it was all there. It's not something that just suddenly sprouted. But what happens is that when you start looking at the texts written in Sanskrit and other regional languages and so on, there's a different kind of argumentation that comes in. First of all, that there are differences, regional differences all over in the country, because these regional languages grow in a different way. There is very little in common between Punjabi and Tamil, and it's part of the subcontinent. So you have to give an answer to the question of why are there these differences. Secondly, the argument that the Hindus were victimized is very doubtful, if not totally incorrect, because many held high office. The Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Kayasts in particular were all high administrators under the Sultans and under the Mughals. So if they were being victimized, they wouldn't be holding high office. And otherwise too, there were traders and there were people in other occupations that were perfectly normal. Secondly, there was a lot of intermarriage between upper castes and the upper classes of Islamic society. And there wouldn't have been these intermarriages between Rajputs and Mughals and so on if, in fact, the Hindus were being victimized. The Bhakti teachers are a mixture, and they have mixed audiences. You have Hindus and Muslims going to them. And there is increasing evidence coming from a number of religious sects and cults that the worship of certain deities was joint, that is, Hindus and Muslims. Hinglaj Mata, for example, that has a very important role in Sindh and Western India and Gujarat, she was worshipped by Hindus and Muslims alike. Krishna Bhakts, for example, we only associate people like Surdas and so on with Krishna Bhakti. But in fact, there were many highly placed Muslims who called themselves Krishna Bhakts and were known as, and there were some of the Sufi peers who also associated themselves with deities and literature of other religions other than Islam. So what we're really dealing with is a very rich and complex society. This simplistic idea that society was divided into two camps and they each went their own way and they hated each other's guts, this is certainly not so. This is something we've had to unlearn and relearn in the light of the new evidence that is coming up. It's very important. Then we come to the nationalist historians, where as far as the ancient history of India was concerned, their big contribution was, first of all, they took different positions vis-a-vis the colonial history. They agreed with the periodization of Hindu, Muslim, and British, but they threw out the idea of Oriental despotism because they said that that was not applicable to India. But they came up with the theory of the golden age of the Guptas and made a big thing out of the fact that this was the utopian age of Indian history. This was when, India reached a peak of glory, etc., etc. Now, when you start looking at this carefully, yes, it was a great age, no doubt, but it was no greater than certain other ages which were equally impressive. The Cholas, for example, in South India, produced absolutely superb monuments, philosophy, literature, and all of that. And later on, the Mughals also produced great things, writing, philosophy, art, architecture particularly. So can one go on talking about just one golden age, or does one have to say that out of this long list of dynasties who ruled, there were three who were outstanding, and you give equal importance to those three? That is a question that is being asked. Now let me turn to what did I learn? All of this was unlearning. What did I learn? Going through all of this and going through the questions that one raised at that time and tried to answer, to debate, to discuss, which went on year after year, the one thing I did learn was to respect precisely this fact that no culture is singular and uniform. Every culture arises out of a mixture of earlier cultures. And therefore, what we sometimes refer to as plurality, that in culture is absolutely inevitable. And in every situation all over the world, whether it's culture, whether it's civilization, if you take civilization, for example, areas could not be civilized if they were not in contact with other areas where knowledge was being advanced, because civilization is an advance of knowledge. You can't have civilization if you don't have an advance of knowledge, whether it is better buildings, better art, better mathematics, better geometry, whatever it may be, better philosophy. By better, I mean more intensive, more complex, more capable of thinking. You can't have all that unless you have an admixture of cultures. So the basic thing one learns is that you look upon the past not as a singular culture trotting along through the centuries, but as a mixture of cultures. And so you have to ask which of the cultures that are mixing, where are they mixing, how are they mixing, what is the end result of that mixing. So the diversity of cultures is terribly important, and particularly important in a territory as large as the subcontinent. And India is virtually the subcontinent. So you have to study the variety of incoming cultures and to study what happens when those cultures come in and how new cultures are created, how cultures keep evolving and mutating as they go through the centuries. This is perhaps best illustrated by something which we often forget and which is fundamental, is that there were no boundaries in the past. Boundaries, that is, you put a red line on a map and say, this is this country and this is that country. That begins when cartography and map making becomes important, which was about 200-300 years ago. Prior to that, you didn't have maps, so you didn't have red lines marking boundaries. You had frontier zones. Now, a superb example of a frontier zone is the northwest of India, because it's got all kinds of people that are coming there and settling down and mixing. And the importance about not seeing cultures with boundary lines, but seeing them with frontier zones is that it gives a lot of flexibility to culture. What you're really tracking in a frontier zone is precisely what is the culture, who's coming in, who's creating what, who's contributing what, how does the language change, how does the philosophy change, how does the art change, how does the economy change, and how does the social structure change as a result of people coming in. So that is the second thing, that we've learned not to look at the past in terms of little bounded kingdoms, but we have to look at it in a much bigger way in terms of frontier zones. And the third really important thing that one has to learn, has learned, and hopefully it'll go on being developed, is that societies horizontally may be fairly uniform, but when you look at them vertically, from up to down, they're very, very different in each category. Your upper castes do not observe the same culture as the lowest castes. There is a distinction. Now, in the early ancient Indian case, the distinction is made very clear, which is that, according to the Dharma Shastras, it is only the people that belong to the four castes that constitutes the upper caste. The rest are all waifs and strays, and they can be included under the various categories of non-castes. That is what we today would call Dalits and people of that. Now, what is important is that if you are going to study a society, you cannot any longer only look at the top class and the top caste. That is not the clue to the society. You have to look at the totality. And you have to see how every little group from top to bottom is interrelated and works with each other. If you're going to be talking about the landowning caste in a particular area, you have to also look at the laboring caste, the cultivating caste, and others who are supplying the wherewithal with which the landowners are enriching themselves on being landowners. There is a very close interrelationship. I mean, it's not the happiest of interrelationships, but it's very close. And the historian today has to understand that interrelationship, which has been ignored in the past. That is also, where are the similarities and where are the differences? And this is very crucial to understand similarities and differences. So that's a little bit of my learning of history.
That's quite a lot to learn and unlearn for history students like us. And thank you so much for laying the ground rules of what to learn and what to unlearn in coming years when this discipline will develop much further. I think there will be many more things that we have to unlearn from
Right.
previous scholarships, and we have to adapt to the
You know,
needs.
it's knowledge is a continuing process. As I used to always tell my students, education means you have to learn to ask questions. That's fundamental. Otherwise, you're not educated. And you ask questions about the world around you. Why are you sitting on a particular kind of chair? Because the chair has a history. And you have to go through understanding how people arose from sitting on the floor to sitting on a bench to sitting on a chair to sitting on a decorated chair to sitting on very complicated, valuable chairs, etc., etc. So everything in life has a history. And the interested student then looks around and says, well, what about the history of this? I'm using a computer. The computer has a history. Why did it change? Why am I not using the same computer that I could have been using 40 years ago? How is it changed? Or what's caused the change? So the how and the why becomes very important.
Professor Thapar, the next question that I would like to ask relates to the role of a historian. You have mentioned how historian looks at the past in the previous answer partially, but as a historian yourself for more than 60 years, 6 decades of scholarship and dedicated scholarship in early Indian history, how do you see the role of a historian, and how does a historian quote unquote reconstruct the past?
What is the role of the historian? Um, this is actually a rather complicated question because we imagine that historians go back to the earliest societies. They don't. The historian was invented again about 300 or 400 years ago. The historian as historian. What did we have before that? The early societies all over the world had people who used to collect narratives about the past and put them together, very often recite them and sing them when the oral tradition was all that there was there. There was no writing. And from that, it has changed to this very complicated, careful, meticulous writing of the past by the historian today. So it's a huge change. It's a tremendous change. You have to keep that in mind. In the old days, there were varieties of people who claim to record the past events. Everybody from the priest to the poet to your grandfather or your grandmother. These were not historians. Historians were invented recently when the discipline of history came into being. And that is an important thing. And why? What is the difference? The discipline of history and historical method teaches a person how to analyze the stories that have come from the past, not just to accept them as they come, because God knows if they're true or not, but how do you analyze them? So in ancient times, the historian was more likely the poet or the bard, very often the bard, who was the author of epics and ballads and folk tales, that kind of thing, who put together the narrative of past times. And one had, they didn't care whether they were authentic narratives. Interesting story, fun story, all right, it gets included. Did what is described actually happen? This was not a question of great concern. It doesn't matter if it happened, it didn't happen. It's an interesting story, it's a fun story. So you include it. Or did the poet imagine all this happening? In which case his imagination was very creative, and that was appreciated. And one sees this very clearly in the epics all over the world, whether it's the Mahabharata and the Ramayana here, whether it's the Homer epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greece, or whether it's so on and so forth. Now, the epics are the first time that you get somebody sitting together and consciously putting together all these stories. And they were recited and they were accepted and people went on with them, as we know. I mean, the Ramayana today has stories which are recited in the Punjab, and they're also recited in Indonesia, and they're also recited in other places. It's a good story which happened to spread very nicely and was picked up and was made part of their culture. Today, the difference is that the historian says, that's all right, that's very beautifully created, poetic, high literary quality composition, the epic, whether it's, let's say, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. But in order to be history, its authenticity has to be proved. That you have to prove that these events actually happened, that these people actually existed. History is based on historicity, the actual happening of something. That was one problem. And it's a problem that continues with all epic literature. Also, were they written by one person at a specific point in time? Or was a small original story added to by various people over the years, generation after generation? As they were reciting the story, they added to it. Now, I am very impressed with the way in which stories are added to when they're orally recited. There's no control. I recite a story and you say, oh yes, and you recite it to your friend. You will add your little bit to it, and your friend will recite it to his or her friend, and they'll add a little bit. See, so that's how the epics slowly grew into that. And the historian today has a problem of having to determine which of these can be historically authenticated and which are imagination, and the two are mixed together. Was it one person who wrote this huge, long epic? Or because it was added to over time, there were multiple poets? Now, they used to think that, for example, Homer was the one poet who wrote the whole of the Iliad and the Odyssey and so on. Until early in the 20th century, they started analyzing the epics of Eastern Europe and discovering that there's a whole process by which epics are put together. It's not one person who gets up and has this genius of creativity. And when they started looking at that and then looking at the Greek epics, they realized that there were many people involved at different times and so on. Now, some of these analyses have been applied to the Indian epics. And one of the most impressive is a person called Dr. V.S. Sukthankar, who was working in the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune, who worked on the Mahabharata. And he has fascinating studies of how little segments were probably put together. And his view was that the Mahabharata as a totality was composed during a period of 800 years, from 400 BC to 400 AD. Not before 400 BC, because what it reflects is the society of the period of 400 BC to 400 AD. And this is where a historical analysis also comes in. If a text is written today, and you have to date it 2,000 years hence, the first thing you say is it the language that was spoken at that time? What it refers to in terms of artifacts and social systems and so on, were these prevalent at that time? And so there are ways by which you test the chronology of, and he's done an absolutely brilliant job, and all of us historians really go by what he says. And the same thing was done for the Ramayana, where they now argue that books 1 to 7 are later. The original text was much closer to books 2 to 6, and the later texts were added on. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that you had this kind of collection of data on the past, but the problems that came with it. The next category of historians, or pseudo-historians, historians that could be, are the authors of inscriptions. We have a huge collection, a very impressive collection of inscriptions from early India. And the interesting thing about inscriptions is that the author of the inscription is generally somebody close to the court, therefore close to political power. He summarizes the information of the dynasty and then focuses on the particular king. And so you have the Hathi Gumfa inscription of Kharwela and Orissa, and you have the famous Samudragupta Prashasti. What is it doing? It tells you about the lineage of the dynasty, who is the family, where it came from, the mythology, the campaigns and the conquests, particularly the person who's the major ruler. Special events, any special events, like if they married into a family that was socially superior, then that would be mentioned in the inscription, as is mentioned in the case of the Gupta dynasty. And very important, there's a date usually at the end, because location in time gives the text greater authenticity and indicates where it was written. So it's very important to mark the point at which dates start coming into inscriptions, which they don't come into any other text like epics and so on. Subsequent to this come the chroniclers, the poets who are attached to the court, and who write both chronicles and historical biographies. They write about the dynasty, and they write about the different events of all the rulers of the dynasty and of the different dynasties that ruled and all of that. Prime example, superb example of a chronicle is, of course, Kalhanas Raj-Tarangani, written in the 11th century. And why is it important? Because it's not just a great piece of literature, which it is, but it's also the kind of text that takes in every facet of the history of Kashmir. I mean, it is amazing what that text knows and does, and the commentary, the indirect commentary that it makes on the dynasties and so on. So that chronicling tradition continues from the late first into the early second, into the period of the Sultanate and into the Mughal period. There are lots of poets attached to the court who are chronicling the dynasties that have ruled. But side by side with that, you get historical biographies, like the famous Bana Bhatta's biography of Harshavardhana, the Harshacharita, which focuses on a particular king. Now, the inscription is very brief and simply gives an outline what Samudragupta may have achieved. But imagine if somebody had sat down to write the life of Samudragupta, what would have gone into it? It would have been an absolutely fantastic biography. So that becomes another genre. And so you have from the late first millennium right through the second millennium, in Sanskrit, in Persian, in the regional languages, chronicles written about the dynasties that have ruled in the different regions, and historical biographies. And as a kingdom becomes more and more centralized, there is more and more focus on the person who's ruling. So the biography becomes extremely important as a genre of literature. And it also becomes the basic historical texts, particularly the chronicles and biographies under the sultans and the Mughals. And this is the point at which the historian is slowly moving into center stage, until finally, in fact, he does come to center stage and really becomes the important person who is controlling the narrative about the past. Now, when that happens, then the historian is also playing a political role. Because by controlling the narrative about the past and saying, this is how it was, these were your origins, and this is how you evolved, he is either legitimizing or delegitimizing those who are in power. So the historian's role becomes very, very crucial and important. How does this change over the years? The epics are concerned with a story of when did something happen, and they have their own chronology. which is tied into the yugas and that kind of thing. It doesn't go by BC and AD, and you can't confuse the two chronologies. You have to make up your mind. When did it happen? Where did it happen? In which part of the world? And what happened? You have a narrative, so-and-so came to rule, and this was how he became a king, and then he married somebody, and then this resulted, and then this, the story goes on. The difference is that when the historian comes into center stage, when the historian is recognized from about the 17th, 18th century, particularly, when European historians start writing about India and so on, the concern is with two questions. How did things happen, and why did things happen? And that concern is something which we historians still continue with. That when you pick up a topic to write your thesis on, the two fundamental questions, once you got over the business of where did this happen and when did this happen and so on, the two fundamental questions, which are the making or the breaking of the historian, are how you tackle how did this happen and why did this happen. The how and the why are very, very important. Do you want me to talk about constructing the past? How do you proceed? All right. This is based on my own experience of having written a PhD thesis and also supervised a number of PhD theses. All right. First of all, we must recognize that it's not an easy process. Historical research is a very complicated process. And I'm not saying this simply because I'm a historian and I want to impress an audience with the fact that it is a very complicated process. And let's be very clear about that. You have to choose what to include and what to exclude. And it's not just that, oh, I like this story, I'll put it in, or I don't like this story, I'll leave it out. You have to justify what you have included and what you have excluded. So that is part of the complication. And the historian always has to begin by asking a question about the past. You can't, people come up to me and say, please give us a PhD thesis subject. And I always turn around and say, I'm sorry, I can't give you a subject. It's not like doling out mangoes. You have to think your way through. You have to understand what it is that's bothering you or that you would like to investigate. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's bothering you, but you feel it'll be fun. It'll be nice to investigate something like this. Like I was saying, the history of the chair. All right, you won't get a PhD thesis on it, but it might be fun to investigate how the chair became from this to that kind of thing. So asking questions is very important, and you always begin your research by one central question, which you feel that you would like to answer. Then you settle down and you gather all the evidence that you can. Now here the modern historian has it fairly simply because the modern historian tends to stick to archives, private papers, previously published documents, etc., etc. It's the ancient historian that has problems, because if you really want to investigate fully a topic in ancient history, you have to know the text, therefore you have to learn the language of the texts. And if you have text in 2 or 3 languages, then you had it, because you have to sit and, at least have a working knowledge of those languages. That is terribly important. It's very difficult. You have to know that. All right, then you have archaeology. And archaeology is becoming increasingly more complicated because the sciences are moving in. If you read an archaeological report of 50 years ago, it's perfectly readable. Any intelligent person can read it and understand what's been said. If you read a report of today's excavations, there is so much of, if they're talking about demography, there's mathematics. If they're talking about something else, there's science, there's genetics, there's science. And unless you have some idea of these sciences, you may get completely lost. So there's that problem, that your sources are not just texts, there are various other things as well, which really is what complicates the picture. So you have to understand, if you're dealing with material culture, you have to understand the technology. If you're going to be using, for example, if you're writing the history of the Indo-Roman trade, as some of us have done in the past, the Indo-Mediterranean trade, all these pottery sherds kept coming up, which were part of amphorae, these jars in which the wine and the oil was transported. Now you then have to know something about how they were made, what was the technology, where there's an indication of their identity. At the base of the jar, there's always the name of the place where they were made. Were they making wine there? Were they making olive oil there? What were they making? These are the technical things. And then, you know, what is the kind of pottery that is being used and so on. You can become very, very technical on this. So the historian has to know a little bit about that at least. So there's that side of it. And then when the evidence has been collected, keeping the original question in mind, whatever answers or explanations you work out, you have to keep on trying them against the evidence. Does this explanation work? Does the second one work better than the first? Shall I discard the first or shall I keep it going? Is the third one better than the first and the second? And so I discard the first two and I only stick to the third. So that also is important, because when you're putting together your evidence and you're trying to answer your question, you have to be clear about one thing. How did the society function in those days? You know, you can't talk about a society being a feudal society if in fact there's no evidence for feudalism. If you're talking about the second century BC, second millennium BC, you can't talk about it being a feudal society. You have to think of some other label for it. See? So there's all of that as well that goes on. Now, the explanation of the society, which is what the historian is trying to get at, is very, very important. But please remember that there's no finality. No historian can say, I have studied this subject, this is my explanation, QED, there's nothing further to say. Because tomorrow you may get by accident another source, or you may get a new method by which you analyze the sources, and you may have to change your mind. So the point is always that you argue as cogently as you can on the basis of logic and rationality to hold your explanation, keeping in mind the fact that maybe this will carry on, maybe it'll never change, or maybe there may be a change, in which case you would then have to see how that fits it. So the answer to that problem is that the historian, perhaps more than other social scientists, has to read extensively. You have to be aware of what other sciences are doing and what they're suggesting in order to be sure that you get the story right.
Maybe we'll take two last questions for the evening. Another question is a very general perspective of history is that history is a boring subject. In schools, many students believe that history is just about dates, victors and victories, and wars and battles. How can we as students of history change this narrative? And with that, what are your views on the state of history in schools, textbooks, and the general perception of history in India?
Yeah, okay. History is a very boring subject. Well, that's partly because we teachers are so boring. If we teachers were more exciting people with exciting ideas, then maybe history wouldn't be a boring subject. But no, seriously. It all depends on how it's taught and what is taught. You know, we've all grown up with this business of history consists of kings, queens, battles, campaigns, bus, conquest. Once you know that, you know history, which is why people read 3 books on history and then they hold forth and say, I know it all. I'll tell you, I know it all. Now that has changed completely today. No self-respecting historian can read 3 books on history and then say, I know the subject. This is just not possible. If it is thought to be boring, and indeed kings, queens, and battles are very boring if they are just recited, and it's, as someone said, reading a textbook in history is like reading a telephone directory. You have the numbers on one side, the dates, and then you have the events that happened, and you just go on reading this thing. Now, how do you get around this? You can do it in various ways. One is, who are the players? Who are the people who are making history? They are people. They may be kings and queens, but they're human beings. What do we know about them? And what do we know about them that is authentic? Not the stories that, you know, Birbal was a joker at the Mughal court, and he told these stories, and so these stories must be true. That's not the case. The stories that you hear, the narratives that you hear must be authentic. You must know. Even battles can be quite interesting and not boring. Let me try and explain what I mean. We know that Chandragupta Maurya fought a battle against Seleucus Nicator, the Hellenistic king of Afghanistan. And we don't know who won. It's a little unclear, but possibly Chandragupta Maurya had the better hand. In the treaty that was drawn up, it's very interesting. The usual thing, territory was ceded to the Maurya, to Chandragupta, which is why we think that Chandragupta probably won the battle. 2 things are mentioned. One is an epigamia, which could mean a marriage alliance between the 2 royal families, or it could also mean an open situation where any Indian could marry any Hellenistic citizen of that area. Now think of the possibilities of that if it was an open situation. Did a lot of Indians marry these close to Greek people? If that happened, what was the result? Is the Greco-Roman art of Gandhara culturally partly occasioned by not just the presence of Greek authority, but maybe these kinds of marriages? We don't know. It's speculation. But it's fun. It makes that event much more interesting if you start thinking of the consequences of such a thing. Then Seleucus Nicator says he wants 500 elephants, and Chandragupta Maurya agrees to give him because the elephants were used in the battle. They were one of the arms of the infantry, cavalry, elephant corps, and so on. And so you then begin to ask, why elephants? What kind of military role did elephants play? So this is another field of inquiry which the teacher or the student can follow up even on his or her own, to check out in what way were elephants useful on the battlefield. Did they have a howdah? What was a howdah like? How many archers sat in the howdah? How fast could they go? It's fun. It's worth asking a question. And then suddenly, the elephants are dominant right up till about the middle of the first millennium, the Gupta period and so on. And then the horses become very important. And the major trade is for good quality horses from Central Asia and Arabia. Why? Because they're needed in the cavalry. And that raises a whole lot of other questions. Why were horses imported? Couldn't they be bred here? If they couldn't be bred in India, why couldn't they be bred in India? What was peculiar about India that it couldn't breed good quality horses? It's a question worth thinking about. And then if it's a horse trade that's coming in, what do we know about the horse trade? And yes, volumes have been written on the horse trade and how important it was. See, all of this stemming from one battle. So I'm just trying to suggest that there are ways in which you can pick up a simple event and then track it in different ways till you land up somewhere quite different from where you started. That's history. And that's the fun of doing history. why it's not boring. Okay, then if understanding the past is necessary to understanding the present, you have to ask questions that are related to the past and present. How has the present come out of the past? How is it linked? Every action that you perform today, is it the same kind of action that was performed in the past, or was it different? When you're watching somebody, of course, nobody does that now, but when you're watching somebody grinding grain, is the chakki in which the grain is being ground exactly the same? Was it different? If it's different, why is it different? How is it changed? Transportation. How did people travel in the past? I mean, you know, people don't think about that. All right, the women were carried in a palanquin. That meant 2 men or 4 men being kept. So instead of keeping one driver to drive your car, you had 4 men to carry your palanquin. And these are the kinds of comparisons that become quite interesting if you start making the comparisons. Then if you're linking the past to the present and asking the question of, did this, what we are doing today, come out of a past, out of something we did yesterday? It becomes quite interesting. It's no longer boring because there's a kind of history to it. There's a kind of, how did it begin? How did it come to this position? How did it change? And so the more questions that you ask about what you're being taught or about what you're surrounded with in the world around you, and the more you ask how and why after you located the what, then you start looking for alternative answers and it begins to become much more interesting. So I would say that blame the teacher by all means, but not entirely. You must have a curiosity in order to be a good history student. Curiosity is very, very important.
Definitely. And this brings me to the last question for the session. Maybe we will end that with a note of positivity and hope
Uh, uh,
that you are from the generation that witnessed freedom of
mm,
India from the British
mm,
colonialism, and the process of decolonization still continues though.
mm.
But if you can go back and if you can remember the zeal, the enthusiasm people had in their minds for a free nation of their own ideas, and how they would develop that. And if you compare India of today, how do you see that, and what are your visions for India of future?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, the way we were taught history in school didn't make it boring at all. And I think that it's very important to understand, first of all, that if people are going to get their idea of history partly from education, teachers have to be properly trained. Teacher training is absolutely crucial. I mean, my generation was extremely fortunate because there were few schools and they were well organized and the teachers were very carefully chosen. We're very privileged. My generation is extremely privileged compared to the way in which education is almost thrown around these days without too much thought as to what it's doing. So the first thing I think that is important is that there has to be an agitation for quality education. That is extremely important. Even in things like, you know, what is the language of instruction, what is the curriculum, what is to be taught, and so on. All of this requires serious discussion, debate amongst educationists. Unfortunately, we have handed education over to people who are the least educated. Across the board, most politicians, with some exceptions, most politicians are not all that well educated. And so they're the ones who are sitting in judgment and deciding on, what should be done in the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Culture and so on and so forth. Now, there's a disparity there. You really do need professional people. The world today would be a great world if there was respect for the profession, the professional. That there isn't. I mean, the academics are the most looked down upon persons. You may keep on talking about in ancient India, we respected our seers and our Rishi Munis and this, that, and the other. But today you're not doing that. Today you're treating your academics as avatava, as marginal. And that you must realize that in every activity that you carry out, the professional has to have center space. The professional's views have to be taken seriously. And they can't be discarded because X government decides that it wants to do this, or Y government comes along and changes it to that, or whatever it may be. There has to be a continuity in education, which is fundamental and foundational to people's understanding. All right. The second problem is, of course, that today a major problem, I think, is that the agencies that are the most influential, like the media, whether it's glossy magazines or whether it's TV channels or cinema, they play the fool with history. They toss it around like a football and they don't know what they're tossing around. The kinds of stories that are put out and the kinds of things that make money, because the aim of the media is commercial. The aim of the media is not to educate. The aim of the media is not to make you ask questions and to think. The aim of the media is not to make you think about your culture and ask, why are we in this culture? Could it be different? Do we want it to be different? It needn't be different. Are we perfectly happy with this culture? Has that debate ever taken place on media? No. It's a fundamental debate. There's a pattern of life that each of us has. Are we content with this pattern of life, or do we wish to change it? And the only way in which you can change it is by giving attention to how you're educated and, what you're surrounded with and how it is that you are, you made to think. Now, I think really the basic issue is, unfortunately, when we look at history, we're looking only at elite groups. So we get a very rosy picture of how well they were educated, what superb philosophies they had, their religious texts, their literary texts, and so on and so forth. Today, we're much more concerned with levels further down that vertical spine that I was talking about. It's not just the elite groups, it's all the way down. And we have a lot to learn from the fact that there is a whole history of those who are at the lower levels, whose history has not been recorded, but is there because they have acted out their history generation after generation. So it is there. You can't say they have no history. It is very much there. So how does one interact between these levels? How does one speak from one level to the other level and decide on what it is that we want from our lives? It's terribly, terribly important. When we were young and we were going through the national movement, let me end on this note. We were very aware of two things. One was the Indian identity that I mentioned. Who are we as Indians? How do we define ourselves? Terribly important, because remember, the nationalism geared to independence was secular democratic nationalism. The other nationalisms were all religious nationalisms. You had the Muslim religious nationalism, you had the Hindu religious nationalism. The Muslim religious nationalism in Pakistan is having immense problems with its history. It doesn't know what to do because it wants to get rid of the Hindu history, and they landed with it. So, do they jump from Harappa to Sindh, to the Arabs in Sindh, and forget about everything? Do they go from Harappa to the Buddhist period and then jump to the coming of Qasim and Mahmud Ghazni, that kind of thing. It is problematic. So religious nationalism has that problem, that if you choose one qualifier for your nationalism, you run into historical problems right away. No question. All right. And we have the same problem with Hindu nationalism. We're so busy trying to wipe out what they call the Muslim period or Muslim rulers and that kind of thing. That you can't do. Now, when we were young, so the identity was based on a secular democratic identity. That was to be the Indian. The second question, which we were all concerned about and thinking about, was what kind of society do we want? That's a very crucial question, which I think that, forgive my saying so, but I think that the generation of the young are not perhaps spending enough time thinking about, leave alone worrying about. Much more thought has to go into, I am now a generation that is 2025, I'm going to create this society. What society do I want? What kind of society do I want? And what we were certain about, what dominated our thinking, which unfortunately has not happened. The fault is as much my generation as any other generation. We didn't push for it hard enough. We were aware that democracy is only possible if you recognize the fact that the relationship in the state today is between the state and the citizen. It's no longer the king and the subject. They're not subjects. We're not subjects anymore. We're citizens. We have rights, and we're all equal. So what are the rights we have? We have the rights of food, water, employment, education, health, and social justice. These are the rights. Now, the rights of the citizen are the rights that make your society the kind of society you want. These are guaranteed by our constitution, but are played around with by one government after another, and certainly are being heavily played around with these days. So I think that if you wish to get back to looking at how we, my generation, looked at the country and the world, you would have to consider the importance of what it is, what it means constitutionally and literally in practice, what it means to be the citizen of a state, and what kind of citizen and what kind of state do we want.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving such an enriching answer to the question of your vision of India. And I think there's so much to learn from you, and we would really wish for another session someday.
I just hope it'll be useful.
No, it is, and I think these are all archival interviews and conversations that we have with you always, and we get to learn so much, and there's so much food for thought that we take with ourselves, and we think about that, and as you mentioned, people occasionally come to you for PhD titles and themes. I think this interview is going to give them a lot of themes, and they can work upon it, especially the history of chair that you mentioned.
Right.
So
It's always a pleasure to talk to Karwaan.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was truly an honor.
And it's great that you're organizing talks.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay.